This video is a presentation of some of my findings from my own personal research carried out on the topic of migration to Britain after the Second World War. It looks at the period from 1948 to 1962, so that's a section of the Windrush Generation leading up to the first Immigration Control Act of 1962. My study compares three old areas of London, one of them being the old municipal borough of Hendon, where I grew up. Hendon has always been, throughout my lifetime, a multicultural and diverse part of London with large Jewish settlements that arrived here long before the Second World War, and then many other people arriving from the Commonwealth and the former colonies after the Second World War. I wanted to compare it to two other multicultural parts of London that maybe I'm less familiar with. So I chose to compare Hendon with the borough of Lambeth and also the London borough of Stepney. Now, my original study was carried out prior to the Windrush scandal that really hit the headlines in 2018. Prior to that, it was widely believed that there were 492 passengers that were on board the Empire Windrush that had travelled from Jamaica and other Caribbean islands, but it's come to light recently that there were many more on board from the Caribbean. So the vessel HMT Windrush would have arrived on these shores here in Tilbury on the 20th of June 1948. It's seen as symbolising the first step towards the multiracial, multicultural Britain that we know of today. However, it wasn't the first vessel to arrive carrying passengers from the Caribbean. A similar vessel, known as HMT Ormond, had arrived on British shores with around 100 Jamaicans on board around a year before the Windrush had arrived. There had already been noted racial tensions in the summer of 1947 when trade unions and middle management had vocally opposed the hiring of black workers in various industries, including the merchant navy, agriculture, construction and the dockyards. The cold reaction of Clement Attlee's Labour government following the war went against their traditional ideology of equality for all. One of the reasons for these hostilities was the fear that black workers would be a drag on the job market. Trade union leaders and representatives saw the newcomers as a potential threat to the fight for higher pay and improved working conditions and some of the gains that had been recently made in the immediate years after the war. West Indians were prepared to work for lower pay within poorer working conditions and therefore could scupper the intentions of the unions. There were concerns that unemployment could in future return to the same scale as in the 1930s, resulting in a greater proportion of so-called native workers losing their jobs. The Windrush Generation arrived largely because the British government passed the British Nationality Act in 1948. This gave citizenship and freedom of movement to those living in the colonies and the Commonwealth. It was hoped that some people from the Commonwealth and the former Empire would move to Britain to help the mother country rebuild after the Second World War. There were shortages of labour in construction and transport that needed to be filled, and many of the newcomers would also help to establish the newly formed National Health Service that gave and continues to give free healthcare to British people. Finding accommodation for the new arrivals posed a problem for the government. The War Office allocated a deep shelter in South Clapham where 280 of the men would be accommodated. Many newcomers from the Caribbean immediately sought employment and they came to the employment exchange here on Cold Harbour Lane. Initially, the government saw the advantage of newcomers wanting to stay in the same area and to congregate. In his cabinet memorandum, Arthur Creech Jones, the colonial secretary, stated, "There is considerable convenience in having the men, other than the 70-odd at the colonial office or hostel, all together." Jones wanted to avoid the possibility of a national scandal and saw the benefits of keeping most of the men in one place. However, the attitude changed when it became clear that the newcomers would become permanent residents in Britain. As the influx continued throughout the 1950s, local authorities began to feel the strain. More than 10,000 new arrivals from Africa and the Caribbean settled in the borough of Lambeth between 1951 and 1961. Brixton therefore became the heart of the African Caribbean community in the UK. Racial tension was certainly present in the 1950s, with reports of fighting between poor white people and black migrants in Paddington in 1954, and in that same year there were worse scenes apparently recorded in Camden with the use of petrol bombs witnessed by passers-by. Racial tension came to a head here in Notting Hill on August Bank Holiday 1958, where white teddy boys went on the rampage, attacking black residents, attacking their cafes, their bars, their businesses and their homes. Around 150 arrests were made on black and white residents over the course of that weekend. The racial tensions highlighted in the Notting Hill riots of August 1958 gave those in the government the perfect excuse to start pushing towards immigration control and push towards the Immigration Control Act of 1962. The trouble is said to have started here on Bramley Road, where some witnesses at the time estimated that up to 700 teddy boys went on the rampage hurling racial abuse at black residents. This was not only a push towards immigration control, but it also had a worrying effect on neighbouring boroughs across London. As a response to the Notting Hill riots, the Trinidad and Tobago-born journalist and activist Claudia Jones organised a Caribbean carnival the following year. This was to become the annual Notting Hill Carnival. A significant part of my study was to examine the knock-on effect that the Notting Hill riots had on other areas of London. Back in Brixton, local council officials, community workers and small businesses owned by black and white people had worked hard throughout the 1950s to achieve assimilation and social integration between the newcomers and the white residents. In Lambeth, the Union of Fascists and the National Labour Party wished to protect Britain from the so-called foreign invasion. Their policies appeared identical to each other's and also some of the far-right groups from more modern times. Slum clearances affected many black and poor white residents of Lambeth. When entire streets like Somerleyton Road were demolished, many of these people would have received priority on the housing list as they became urgently in need of new housing straight away. This caused tension and the age-old perceived notion of some residents and immigrants in particular getting priority over English folk. Like with lots of misinformation within local communities and the national press, this would have led to more racial tension. And there were similar concerns here in Stepney, East London too, with reports of black people leaving the East End to try and avoid a race war. The local press, including the Stratford Times, reported that they wanted to avoid war at all costs, following the scenes across London in Notting Hill. Now, Stepney is unique to my study because it was culturally diverse years before the Windrush and years before the Second World War. This was because it's not far from the London Docklands, or what used to be the London Docks, where sailors from all around the world would come visit the area, visit Commercial Road, and sometimes settle for good. Commercial Road is still a vibrant place and a focal point where many people meet in the East End. Now, black people at the time were harassed and often accused of loitering when their purposes for being there were completely innocent. Many historians at the time even acknowledged that black people were becoming victims of the social breakdown that already existed. They also acknowledged that black people were actually being blamed for the social breakdowns that had actually been occurring for the best part of a century. Stepney also had more reports of mixed relationships and marriage than anywhere else in my research. You can imagine that this would have caused outrage in the 1940s and 1950s amongst the local communities. The reason for the mixed marriages could be down to the disproportionate amount of men that arrived from Africa and the Caribbean compared to women that arrived from those places. Therefore, if these men were to make a life for themselves in post-war Britain, statistically they'd be more likely to marry a white woman from that local area. Tensions may have eased slightly more in Hendon as housing projects gave people more homes. Perhaps people in Somerleyton Road in Brixton, or in places in Stepney for example, did not have the opportunities to move into places like this. Now, the West Hendon estate wasn't built until the late 60s, but there were various other projects going around in the area and in the local boroughs as well, like Spur Road in Edgware, where London was expanding. So overcrowding may not have been so much of a problem in Hendon as it was in places like Lambeth and Stepney. As a result of that, racial tension may have been slightly lower here as well. At least on the surface, welfare problems seemed less serious in Hendon than in any other districts in the county of Middlesex. As newcomers arrived in other parts of the county, demands on the health service increased. This was particularly the case with regards to children of immigrants. The resources of local health services, notably antenatal clinics, became stretched when attended by mothers who could not speak English. A report by a county medical officer suggests that a high level of so-called illegitimate children born to immigrant mothers. Immigrant mothers would return to work sooner than English mothers following birth, resulting in a higher demand for child admission to nurseries or childminders. In some Middlesex districts, it was not uncommon for non-white children to be deemed unacceptable by nurseries or childminders on the basis of their colour. Consequently, immigrant children would occasionally receive priority, causing resentment amongst British mothers who felt that immigrants were being given preferential treatment. These cases seem more frequent in areas like Willesden and Southall than in Hendon, where it was a much lesser scale. The report also said that there have been no exceptional demands on their health service, although the area has a fair number of coloured children attending its day nurseries, and in some cases it can be found that children of immigrant mothers at work have been unsuitably placed with foster mothers or childminders. The problem is, however, not a large one. So again, if we compare it to other areas of Middlesex and London, the space for racial tension in Hendon does seem possibly lower. Now, this area of Childs Hill would have just about fallen under the old municipal borough of Hendon, and at the time it was home to a dry cleaners that employed 35 black Caribbean migrants out of a workforce of about 240. Now, a report at the time suggested that many of the employees, black and white, were happy and satisfied with the conditions they worked with and reported very little to no racial tension. However, the local press did not really examine it that thoroughly. There was some tension between black and white employees, particularly two women, and both of these women were dismissed as a result. The report did not go into detail as to what caused this friction, but it made an assumption that the employees were completely impartial, as it ended up with the same outcome, with both women being dismissed. It's really important to point out that despite not seeing as much evidence of racism compared to other areas of London, and a denial from local officials that there was any sort of colour bar in the borough, it doesn't mean that racism didn't exist in the area. We know this was certainly the case for Golders Green, where anti-Semitic graffiti was sprayed upon local synagogues. There was a clear far-right presence, and it was even manifested in Hendon, or it was visited from the outside. Seeing how my research focuses on the relationship between migrants from the Commonwealth and white locals, I will have to visit the problem of anti-Semitism another time. Well, that just about wraps up my first video on Commonwealth immigration to Britain, and there's plenty of scope for a follow-up. By 1962, the patterns of migration to Britain were changing, as migration from the Caribbean was overtaken by migration from the Indian subcontinent. This led to further attempts to roll back the terms of the original British Nationality Act of 1948, and prominent figures like Enoch Powell rise to the surface with his controversial Rivers of Blood speech. I'd like to make another video on the impact of his Rivers of Blood speech on similar areas of London that we've looked at in this video. Until then, I hope this video has been helpful to my students, and I hope to see you soon.